This will be English Colonization Part 6. We're going to try to finish up Jamestown here. It's quite a bit of stuff. This one's pretty important. And then, if we can, we'll move on next to Massachusetts up in New England. We had just had John Smith's encounter with the Indians, where he was rescued by Pocahontas. A little bit more about Pocahontas. She was apparently very intelligent. She visited back and forth freely with the English. She learned English quickly. She served as a liaison, sometimes a guide, so she was well known in both camps. And eventually she was captured by the English. This is a few years later. It's after John Smith was gone. And I don't know, you heard of Stockholm Syndrome, where captives will join their captors? We don't know if it was that or she just understood her role as the daughter of Powhatan, but she assimilated with the English. She was baptized an Episcopalian. She took the Christian name Rebecca, and she married a prominent colonist named John Rolfe. We'll pick that story up later. Now, perhaps you're wondering, going back to Pocahontas and John Smith, was there a thing going on between John Smith and Pocahontas? I'm going to say no, unless John Smith is one serious perv, because he's 27 and she's probably about 12. So, no, that's very unlikely. Although the only thing you can't rule out is that little girl crushes have been known to occur. Now, once she was a grown woman, she married a prominent colonist named John Rolfe. He's the one who basically introduced tobacco culture, figured out how to grow tobacco, and gave the colony an economic reason to exist. And in 1617, the Rolfes sailed over to England. She was an enormous hit. She would have had her face on all the cover of all the tabloids if they'd had those. She made all the parties of the rich and famous. She was introduced to the king. The English were fascinated by how exotic she was. In fact, the deal was her father was an emperor. Emperors outrank kings. And a meeting was arranged, I think without her being warned in advance, between her and John Smith, who was alive and well over in England. The meeting didn't last very long. She had been told when he disappeared, she'd been told that he had died. She had believed that, and now here he is. So she was more than ticked to learn that she'd been lied to. Anyway, while the Rolfes were in England, she gave birth to a son whom they named Thomas Rolfe. They got ready to go back to Virginia. They're on the ship headed down the coast. She fell ill with pneumonia and died at the age of 22. John Rolfe left his son in England to be raised by his brother, John Rolfe's brother. And then when Thomas Rolfe grew up and attained his majority, he moved on to Virginia, took up his father's land holdings, became very prominent. And John Rolfe and Pocahontas, a.k.a. Rebecca, have many, many descendants living today through John Rolfe. Okay, back to Jamestown. We looked at the starving time. That was the low point. After that, things got better. And for example, by 1610 or so, the company directors had decided to permit the colonists to raise their own food. The idea of buying food from the Indians had not worked out. That was contributing to the high death rate. For another thing, the company was finding it very difficult to recruit new employees to go replace the ones who were dying so fast in Virginia. So early on, this is like 2 years in, 1609, they sweetened the deal. If you paid your own way, you paid to ride the ship to Virginia as opposed to going over as a company employee, you would receive a share of stock in the company. And then if you work for the company as an employee, for 7 years, like you're going to live that long, right? Then you could cash that in for a land grant, something like 50 acres of land, and that looked like that's a lot to land-starved Englishmen. It was under that deal that John Rolfe came in. In fact, I believe he was aboard the ship that rescued the starving time survivors. To keep things organized for a little while, around 1613, the governor was a Sir Thomas Dale who imposed military discipline. The men slept in barracks. They would rise to the beat of a drum, eat their breakfast, march in formation out to the fields, till the fields. So everything's being taken care of. Crops are being raised and harvested, the roof's fixed, all that. But who's going to travel to Virginia to live in a boot camp? So, but people did continue to arrive and die. Around 1616, someone counted noses, and of the roughly 1,600 men and a small number of women who'd gone to Virginia in the first 9 years, about 350 were still alive, and almost none had gone back to England. So the colony eventually, thanks to John Rolfe, finds an economic reason to exist. If it doesn't do that, it's not going to last. John Rolfe was on a ship that headed over and got there just as the starving time survivors were abandoning the place. The ship was delayed by a storm. They lay over for a winter on the island of Bermuda, which is out in the mid-Atlantic. And there, John Rolfe observed tobacco being cultivated commercially, so he knew what the plant looked like and had learned some things about how to cultivate it. He gets to Virginia and finds the undomesticated virgin wild tobacco plants growing in the vicinities, so 1 + 1 does equal 2. He figured that if those will grow, the commercial grade tobacco will grow. Well, he couldn't just go online and have an Amazon drone drop him some seeds in a guidebook. It took several years, but in 1616, Rolfe and a few other men sent a total of around 1,500 pounds of tobacco back to England. And if the high five had been invented in those days, there would have been high fives all around in the boardroom of the Virginia Company of London. In 1617, the colony was granted a monopoly on all tobacco sales to England. So the tobacco wasn't really very good as tobacco goes, but they've got a reason to exist. Okay, comes the year 1619. Excuse me, mercy. Take a swig here. Several things happen in that 1 year. They're just coincidental, and all of them changed the course of history. They may look small in isolation. A couple of them, the first two, have to do with yet another reorganization of the company sponsoring the colony. One of the important ones was they sweetened the deal still more to try to get settlers to go to Virginia, that by instituting something was called the headright system. There should be a title on the screen for that. The headright system. Since they don't have the money to pay anybody to go to Virginia and take that risk and work on somebody else's land, they can't afford that. But they got to have workers on company land to produce company tobacco. One thing they do have a lot of is land. So they're going to recruit workers and pay them in land, and they're going to pay them up front. So the headright system meant that for every head or person entering the colony, assuming you pay your own way, don't go at company expense, a grant of land will be made. I believe it was 50 acres. Now, if you're already there, they're going to give you 200 acres. Newcomers will get 50 acres. If you bring dependents with you or pay their way later, you get 50 more acres for each person that enters the colony. So you can pile up some land pretty fast. there's a string attached. Okay? The other part of the deal is you're going to work as an employee of the company on company land a certain amount of time every year, presumably during the growing season. So they pay you up front to get you over there. You don't have to work 7 years or anything. And it's any 50 acres you happen to want, as long as nobody else is already claiming it. And we'll see later kind of what went wrong with that, because we'll come back to it in another heading. But the combination of free land and, for the time being, highly profitable, easily cultivated crop, tobacco, Virginia, by that time, has got like 12 or 14 different settlements, including Jamestown. It gets to be like a boom town. Boom towns have certain characteristics. They have the promise of easy money to be made. They have rapid population increase, and they got a pretty much out of control law and order situation. Again, all of that will be dealt with later on. The labor requirement of the headright system was dropped in only about 5 years. I'll come to that. But that doesn't mean it's over. All that went away was the labor requirement. It's still extremely handy for attracting a new population. It would go on to be used as the land distribution system in Virginia, Maryland, both Carolinas, and much later on Georgia and parts of Pennsylvania. So it was the most widely used long-term land distribution system. Okay, the next 1619 event is the origin of representative government in English America. Now, that is huge. When the last American history book is written, what will be the significance? What did we contribute to the world? Well, quite a bit of stuff, not least would be the idea of representative government. Now, the English had pioneered it in a way with the institution of Parliament, that's their legislature, but hey, they're still technically a monarchy, aren't they? So we developed representative government, and the concept of representation would evolve along very different lines here from how it did in England. Here's the deal. Same reorganization of the company in 1618. They decided it might be a good idea to give the settlers the false impression that they were participating in management decisions. Anytime you're a line worker and the management comes out with something like that, take it with a grain of salt. Anyway, they agreed to authorize a legislature, that's a elective lawmaking body, to be known as the House of Burgesses. We don't really use the word Burgess anymore. It means town dweller. It's a close relative of the French word bourgeois, if that rings a bell. Each plantation, and there are like 14 of them by that time up and down the York and James Rivers, they could elect 2 delegates to sit in an annual session of the House of Burgesses. So, the first meeting of the Virginia House of Burgesses took place, it's either the last week of July, I think it's the last week of July in the year 1619, in the church building at Jamestown. And if you'd been there, you would have been asleep in 20 minutes. It had all the snap, crackle, and pop of your typical city council meeting. They're haggling over one of the members' credentials, and one of the members died while it was going on. I guess the others noticed. We know about it. But that's the start of something huge. All right, it took root. It dodged some bullets, so to speak. It was the company that authorized it had its charter canceled in 1624, and the James I and his son ended up allowing it to continue. Every one of the 13 eventual colonies would have something like the House of Burgesses. So we became very accustomed to representative government, as we shall see. And shall we say, what word shall I use? Misunderstanding about how representation worked is going to figure into the background of the revolution. We're going to get to that in part 7.